Our guest today is Jim Bear Jacobs. Welcome, Jim Bear. It's really great to have you here. Um, Jim Bear is born in St. Paul. He's a member of the Stockbridge Munsee Mohican Nation, an American tribe located in central Wisconsin, but they traveled a lot and we're also on the East Coast. You have degrees in pastoral studies and Christian theology and have served various churches as a youth minister, adult Christian educator, and director of men's activities. He's parish associate at Church of All Nations Presbyterian Church, and he is a cultural facilitator in the Twin Cities, helping to raise awareness of Native American causes and injustices. He's founder and convener of Healing Ministries, an initiative dedicated to creating events for dialogue and education and healing, particularly within faith communities like ours. He is director of racial justice for the Minnesota Council of Churches. And I am particularly interested in, well, so many of your roles, but your story. Can we hear a little about you?
Sure. First of all, ahu kunamante ni dijinjimakwa, Jim Bear Jacobs, ni takdelungamau, ni mexicanu, and kakosatoa kunamante, nishik wewenet. I give you greetings and just kind of reintroduce myself. A lot of what I just said, Jerry has already said. I am from the Turtle Clan, and I'm a citizen of the Stockbridge Munsee Mohican Nation. And with goodness in my heart, I extend my gratitude for this invitation today. So it's always a complicated question to tell my story. Because I think from a Western perspective, when we're asked to tell our story, it begins at birth, right? But from an indigenous perspective, to tell our story, we have to go back many generations. And my people, the Mohican people, our origin narrative is a narrative of journey and travel. And so there are different genres of origin narrative within indigenous peoples, and I mean that globally, indigenous peoples. But two primary genres that emerge are creation narratives, meaning you have a beginning that is located someplace, but then there are journey narratives. And our origin narrative is that of a journey narrative. And for the Mohican people, we started somewhere west and north. And for various reasons began journeying south and southeast. And there is talk, in this story, there is a mention of crossing over where lands almost touch. And where they almost touch is called the mussel-bearing sea. So just a body of water with a lot of clams and stuff. A lot of anthropologists, this is a very loud mic. A lot of anthropologists look at these travel narratives and will try to locate that mussel-bearing sea as, the land bridge between the what is now Russia and Alaska. That's a possibility, but also when you look at a lot of the bodies of water that are found in Western and Northern Canada, a lot of those bodies of water could fall into this category of a mussel-bearing sea. But where it is said that we started out was given the name Mexicanu. which in the Mohican language means waters that are never still. And as our people journeyed, they were looking for a place that resembled where they came from, Mohicanu, waters that were never still. And they continued to journey east and south until they found it. And where we settled is what is now called the Hudson River, in the Hudson River Valley, basically from Manhattan to Lake Champlain in upstate New York. That whole Hudson River Valley is all ancestral homelands for the Mohican people. And when they arrive at that river, they name that river Mohicanu, or the waters that are never still. And when they arrived, they said, "We have found our home." And so the Mohican people, Mohican is just a short hand version for what we call ourselves. We are the Mohicania. We are the people of the waters that are never still, is what our name is. And that title, the Mohicanu River, the Hudson River, is given not because rivers inherently are never still waters, they're constantly moving, but the Hudson River is actually a tidal river, which means it is affected by the tides of the ocean. And so there are actually times during significantly high tides that the Hudson River will actually flow backwards. And so it's this ebbing and flowing motion that gives the Mohicanu River that name. It's constantly ebbing and flowing. So we were the first people to meet Henry Hudson as he sailed up the Hudson River in his explorations. There were a lot of tribes that were in that upper northeast area. And the best way to explain it is that we are related to them all. Okay, so even though there are tribal distinctions, there's a lot of intermarrying happening. And so it is really difficult to, I don't think anyone can say, "Oh, I'm 100% Mohican," because there's Lenape blood, there's Mohawk blood, and we had this system to keep track of everything. So as I introduced myself, you may recall that I said I'm from the Turtle Clan. And the Turtle Clan, this clan system for our people is a way, it does have some social designation. So depending on what clan you are born into, it's not a hard designation of what your job is going to be amongst the community, but it is generally held that people from the Turtle Clan are spiritual helpers come out of this. So probably very apt that I am a pastor. Maybe it was unavoidable, right? But also the clan system is a way of tracking these family lines. And so I know that because I am Turtle Clan, and also I should say the clan system follows a matrilineal line. So it doesn't matter what your father is or your grandfather is, it's what your mother and grandmother are. And so I know that if I meet someone who is even from a different tribe that originates in that area, and they also are Turtle Clan, I know that we are related by blood somehow. Even if we can't track the actual, generational names, we know that we are related. And this has happened many times. Here in Minnesota, we have a large Anishinaabe or Ojibwe population up in northern Minnesota. Now, the Ojibwe people did not originate in Minnesota. They are actually an East Coast tribe, and they journeyed to come into what is now northern Minnesota. And I have met Ojibwe people, and some of those tribes have turtle clans within their tribe, and I know that we are related. And so it's just kind of a neat way of even, you can't track multiple generations back how you're actually related, you know that you are related by blood. And as such, traditionally, I would be forbidden from marrying anyone within the same clan. You marry outside of your clan to avoid all of the genetic problems that can happen when there's not a lot of diversity in there. And so as I said, I am Turtle Clan. The Mohican people stay on the East Coast along the Hudson River Valley for generations. There's no timeline that we can track of how long they were there. But we do know that when European colonization began happening, really in the late 1500s, early 1600s, things got really, really messy. We were essentially kind of moved out of the Hudson River Valley, and to use today's language, what would be considered our very first reservation was in western Massachusetts, a town called Stockbridge, Massachusetts. The best way to describe that, it is literally a Norman Rockwell kind of town. And I say that because that's where Norman Rockwell lived, had his studio, painted. Excuse me. Stockbridge, Massachusetts was a divided town. It was call it an Indian mission for the Indians of Stockbridge, but it also, had a large white population. And Stockbridge, Massachusetts is very steeped in early American Christian history too. So folks like Jonathan Sargent, who was a very early American, well, can't even call him American, this is before America. And also, I always forget his name, but there's a very famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And I can't remember his name. Someone know his name? Jonathan Edwards, yes. So he was also a minister there. And Jonathan Edwards served a dual purpose in Stockbridge. He was the minister so he was a congregational minister for the white population of Stockbridge, but he also was the missionary for the natives of Stockbridge. And here's how colonization works, right? It was the job of the Indians to pay him for both roles. So I've seen very, very early contracts, if you will, that it was the job of the Mohican people to make sure he was supplied with firewood and, food and all of this. So the Mohican people were paying. So essentially the white people got a free minister. Now, we were in Stockbridge for a significant amount of time, and we really were living amicably with the white colonizers. And we were making our best effort to assimilate, if you will, as a means of survival. And so we built homes, like actual timber-built homes. We established some businesses, all of this, and we had a small economy. And then George Washington and all of his revolutionaries decide they want independence. And there's this great war, the Revolutionary War for Independence. And this takes all of the native people in that area, and we are essentially forced to choose sides. Are we going to fight for the British and the crown, or are we going to fight for the revolutionaries? And the Mohican people chose the side of the revolutionaries. So we fought in the American War of Independence. And one of my direct ancestors, he's about an 8th great-grandfather, was named Hendrik Apumat. He actually fought alongside George Washington, like not just Washington's army, but actually fought alongside George Washington. Apumat was given a field promotion. He became a captain, actually by George Washington himself. George Washington physically handed Apumat his captain's sword, made him a captain in the Revolutionary Army. And the reports we have from this time period, the stories that are handed down, is that the Mohican people were incredibly effective soldiers for Washington because we knew the landscape. You may recall this is a time when this so-called guerrilla warfare tactic, like hiding in the trees as opposed to lining up and waiting to get shot kind of warfare, is happening, which really served our expertise as Indigenous people very well. The war also was very decimating for the Mohican people because, as is often the case when large colonial powers go to war with each other, if you have these expendable people with brown skin, you're going to send them in to the dangerous situations. And so it is estimated that as much as a quarter of our men of fighting age actually died in the Revolutionary War. But the war is over. We, Mohican people, happen to choose the winning side and help that cause. And when the men come back to their homes in Stockbridge, what they find is that the white people of Stockbridge have taken over their homes and taken over their businesses. And so our first relocation was out of the Hudson River Valley into western Massachusetts. And then once the Revolutionary War is done, our warriors come back. They have no home any longer. And so what ends up happening is really from the late 1700s until 1830s, Mohican people just get forcibly relocated around the country. And so it is said, and I have found it to be accurate in the little bit of research that I've done, that anywhere from basically the Mississippi River to the East Coast in this sort of, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, and East, anywhere that bears the name Stockbridge or Muncie are areas, places where we were relocated for a time. So there's a Stockbridge, Wisconsin, I think Stockbridge, Indiana, there's Muncie, Indiana, there's some of these names in Ohio. But these are areas where we were relocated for a time. And the relocation time was incredibly devastating because it almost always followed this formula. We were told we were being moved, and this new location would be our new home. And so we would establish communities there. We would plant crops. We would tend to the crops. And just before it came time to harvest the crops, we would be relocated again. And so all of our crops then became to the benefit of the new settlers who were coming into the area. And we hopped all around the country, or this part of the country, until in the late 1820s, early 1830s, there is a tribe in Wisconsin. They're a very large tribe. They're called the Menominee people. And the Menominee people actually took a small section of their treaty-established reservation, and they carved out about 35,000 acres for Mohican people, and they gave it to the Mohican people so that we could have a permanent location. And so if you look on a map of Wisconsin, if you look in kind of central eastern Wisconsin, if it has the tribal reservations on the map, you'll see the Menominee Reservation is a very large rectangle, kind of in the Shawano County, just west of Green Bay area. Very large reservation. And then there's a dot on the southern border, and that's my reservation. And so we were settled there, and that became our home. Our reservation has shrunk a little bit since then. It's about 26,000 acres right now, and that's all political nonsense. And so this is really since about 1832 until present day. This area in central Wisconsin is now the Mohican land. It's our reservation. And that's 1,100 miles away from our ancestral homeland. Okay. So since 1830, this is where my people have been. It's where my grandparents were born, Howard Jacobs and Greta Tausey, and they got married. It's where my family line originates from. And so this is a long way to answer, tell me your story. So my father was born on that reservation in central Wisconsin, the youngest of 9, 10, but one died very early in childhood. So the youngest of 9. Now, when my father reached the age of, after high school, 18 years old, this is a time in our nation's history where there was an incredible effort to try to urbanize the American Indian population. And this was all due to, really, this was the latest version of how to solve the Indian problem, right? The Indian problem has always been a problem since colonization came to the country. And there have been different waves of how do we solve the Indian problem. Prior to this, it was, can we kill as many as we can, and that will solve the problem. But by the time you get into the mid-20th century, killing Indians is not really politically correct and acceptable anymore. And so now, how do we solve the Indian problems? Well, if we can get them off their reservations, move them into urban centers, then maybe these people won't be so dependent on what the treaties say that we have to provide for them. And so there was a large incentive to move Native people off of their reservations. They were incentivized with promises of education and job training and career training and things like this. And actually, Minneapolis and St. Paul was not one of the targeted urban areas for Native people to move to, but it kind of just by default happened. And really, it's kind of unavoidable, right? I mean, there are 11 reservations in Minnesota. There are 11 reservations in Wisconsin. There's, I forget how many in the Dakotas. I mean, we're kind of surrounded by Native reservations. And so my father followed this promise of a better life into the Twin Cities. None of these promises ever materialized. The educational opportunities were very minimal at best. Career training, things like that. there were programs that were set up through like the Job Corps and things like that. But oftentimes what was discovered is when natives would apply for these career training positions and opportunities, it was like those positions were already filled. It was kind of a Indians need not apply kind of situation. And so out here in the Twin Cities is where my father met my mother. And so that is why, I am born 250 miles away from our reservation, which the reservation is 1,100 miles away from our ancestral homeland. And so I was born here in St. Paul, spent so many days of my entire life in and around St. Paul. I haven't wandered far. As a matter of fact, I still live in the same neighborhood that I grew up in. My kids go to the same schools that I went to. So that is a very long and complicated way of kind of getting to my story and how I was born in the Twin Cities here, even though my people are not a local tribe.
And so you grew up hearing these stories. I mean, I look at your people as the original storytellers. Mm-hmm. We have Ancestry.com, and, what we go back to is pretty puny compared to, the history you're talking about and the hundreds of years. But this is what you grew up hearing, and I think that's really important. I don't know, I didn't grow up hearing those kinds of stories with my ancestors, that they were, hundreds of years old. Only now am I more interested in hearing, where they came from. So I would suspect that creates a feeling.
Oh, absolutely. It creates a sense of deep connection. And I notice this too, because I'm a storyteller, I pay attention to how other people tell their stories. And one thing that I've noticed, and this is not universal, but it's a pretty accurate generality. When Indigenous people talk of our generational stories, we use first-person pronouns. And so you may have noticed that when I was talking about, even way back in the Revolutionary War, I said we, did this. Our people did this, right? What I found is that when white people try to tell their same generational stories, they use third-person pronouns. So it's they did this, they did that. And really, you only use first-person pronouns really for like 2, maybe 3 generations, right? And it's maybe only the people you have direct knowledge of, So if you knew your grandparents, you may include them in us and we. But very few of us ever knew our great-grandparents, so that kind of is where that shift happens. And I think these stories give me a sense of connection, that these are my people, that I am never distant from my ancestors, that they are present with me always. And I think that's really sad for white people, that there's not that rootedness and there's not that connection. Because let's be honest, for white people in America, it's almost impossible to formulate any sense of connection to land, to place, right? If we just took 20 minutes to do a nation of origin kind of study here. I mean, sure, we're going to have overwhelmingly Scandinavian, but even that is going to be broken up between Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, all of this. We're going to have a healthy collection of German ancestry in here, but then we're going to get Irish, we're going to get, Polish, we're going to get all of these. And these are all contained within the same body, the same person, right? I mean, is anyone in here 100% from some? Okay. So we have like 3 out of the whole room, right? So it's very difficult for American white people to find a connection and rootedness into place, into land. And so I think that has to be supplemented by a generational connection. And it's, I actually am quite grateful for things like Ancestry and 23andMe and all of this, because it's actually getting white people interested in that connection and interested in that. And I think that has been missing in white culture for so long, is this sense of connection, which I think really, right, is why we gather on Sundays like this, right? Because it ties us through ritual and ceremony into something that is centuries old. You're a Lutheran church, so that tradition is about 500 years old, but it connects, through the Protestant Reformation and eventually a tie to the Catholic Church and to tradition and connectedness that is, 2,000 years old. So when we come together in ceremony and ritual under the name of Christ, and we break bread and we share wine, that is a ceremony that even predates Jesus. Jesus kind of gave us its final form that we practice, but that ceremony of breaking bread and blessing wine and sharing it, goes back to the time of Moses. It's that connection. And we don't even think in American culture that that's how we should think of it. But that's what it is. It's this deep connection. And I think maybe if we really examined our ceremonies that we have in the Christian church, primarily the Eucharist and baptism, if we really examine their origins and their deep meanings, maybe that can help us erase some of the meaningless divisions that we create among ourselves.
One of the things you do through Healing Minnesota is sacred site tours. And I notice a lot of them are at Bedote, where the rivers meet, the Minnesota and the Mississippi. Tell us more about that part of the healing.
Yeah. So these sacred sites tours that I conduct, I started doing them in 2011. So it's been quite a while. And really, I started doing them because those stories were revealed to me a few years prior to 2011. I don't actually know what year the stories kind of first were revealed to me, but I remember that once I heard these stories, I realized that, I grew up in the Twin Cities. I navigated the public school system. I got an undergraduate degree, got a graduate degree, all within Minnesota. And I was fully into my adulthood before I ever realized that I didn't know the indigenous story, the story of the indigenous people of Minnesota. And so this kind of catalyzed a realization in me that if I don't know these stories, and I'm a native kid, and so you know how it is when you're in, sitting in public school. Well, maybe you don't, so I'll tell you. When you're a native kid sitting in public school, particularly a suburban public school like I went to, I was only one of 2 native people in my entire high school. So whenever any lessons or history about native people come up, you're going to listen and you're going to take this in. And so here I was, an adult, and I didn't know any of these stories about the indigenous people of Minnesota, which then caused me to realize that if I don't know these, then everybody else that I went to high school with and college with, they don't know these stories. And really, if we are going to make our homes on this land, we are going to build our churches on this land, we owe it to the indigenous people to at least know who they are and to know their stories. And so I sat with Dakota storytellers. The Dakota are the indigenous people of Minnesota. I sat with Dakota storytellers, Dakota elders, and just learned and listened. And I originally started out conducting these tours by hiring a Dakota person to tell these stories when I would bring groups out. But what ended up happening is my Dakota storyteller, he had a regular full-time job. And when you're building something and you're starting out, nobody pays you anything. And so here I was asking this gentleman to take a day off of his work, to lose those wages, and hope that he could get enough to cover his lost wages. And sometimes that didn't always work out, and I felt really bad, that he's actually losing money to do this. So I asked permission from him and other Dakota elders and said, look, I feel bad that this is costing you money when I do this. And I don't have the money to make up the difference. So would it be possible for me, because I'm not Dakota, for me to conduct these and tell these stories? And I got vetted by these Dakota elders. I say I was sent up the chain of Dakota grandmothers. And eventually received enough permission that I felt comfortable that I had some legitimate community backing to do these. And so I started conducting the tours in 2011. And I honestly thought that by the end of 2012, I would have exhausted everyone who wanted to hear this, and I would have to find some other outlet to utilize my gifts and talents. And I have never been more wrong about anything in my life, because 2012 came, it ended, and the phone kept ringing, and the emails kept coming, the requests kept coming in 2013 and 2014. And so I've been conducting these since 2011. We have, in that time, we've had I think it's close to 13,000 people on these tours. And that's no small feat because a typical group is about 35 people. So it's It's a lot of groups. Last year, and understand I only do these tours from mid-April to mid-November because I'm not an idiot. I don't want to sit out in the snow. It's a 4-hour experience. We're outside the whole time. So I don't do them typically in the winter. If I do get the request to do them in the winter, I charge more because if I'm going to shiver, you're going to pay me to shiver. And so last year we did just under 50 of these tours. Sometimes it's 3 a week. They're typically at the Bidota area, the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi River, which if you come on a tour next year, you will hear how this river valley, Bidota is what it's called in the Dakota language, how this Bidota holds the stories of Genesis and genocide. It is a place where humanity first draws breath, and it is a place where an unbelievable number of Dakota people drew their last breath. It holds incredible historic trauma in this land, and it is a passion of mine. I have absolutely no doubt that this is spirit-driven. I will admit that I'm a pretty good storyteller. I'm an above-average storyteller. But we are seeing groups come from other parts of the country to come and experience this, to experience this model of learning. And it is, fundamental to why I think this model of learning works is because the land itself holds stories. The land has memory. And years and years ago, I was asked by some white capitalist-driven person, says, if you could just package this in an easy to swallow pill that you could, bring in a PowerPoint presentation to, churches and college classrooms. If you could do that, you could make a lot more money doing this. And you'd be able to reach so many more people. And so I tried it. I put together the PowerPoint slides and the pictures, and I brought it outside of location and into 4 walls, and there was no magic. There was none. It was all the power had been taken out of it. And so I don't do that anymore. People ask me, hey, can you bring this in? We're a retirement community, and we have a lot of people with accessibility issues. And I say, you know what? I'm sorry, but I can't. I have made the experience as accessible as possible. It's, wheelchair accessible, people with walkers, we provide chairs if you need, these kind of things. But I just can't bring it in because, yes, I am a storyteller, but the land itself is a storyteller. And if you take that storyteller away, then it doesn't have the impact. And so we're seeing groups from around the country who come, who hear about us and make journeys. So we've had folks from both coasts, Georgia, they've come up, Chicago, we have groups from Chicago that come up quite regularly. And really it's, I sit back and I'm amazed because I literally thought that this was just a flash in the pan and that it would last a year, 18 months at the most, and then I would be done. And I was okay with that. I didn't start this to become have any notoriety on my name. I didn't start this to make money. In fact, in those early years, I gave more tours away for free than I ever collected any kind of money on. This was all about just following a vision of what is our responsibility as Minnesotans. And it is, we owe it to the Dakota people to know who they are, to know their story. I mean, if we're going to walk on their land, we're going to worship on their land, we're going to live on their land, we owe it to them to know who they are.
What is the church's role in the healing that needs to be done? What kind of healing needs to be done?
Yeah, so healing, healing is a two-way street. It's very easy to look at the state of Native communities and to see, the poverty and the disparities on job opportunities, education, health. It's very easy to look at those disparities and say, well, obviously there's some kind of healing that needs to take place. How can we, the godly Lutheran of Minnesota, help heal that community? If you're hearing a little bit of skepticism in my voice as I describe that, it's because I'm skeptical of that. But there's also a reciprocal healing that needs to take place. We as the church, we need to heal. Our entire narrative of who we are on this land, we tell that narrative without the indigenous story. Our entire formulation of who God is on this land is absent the indigenous perspective. So we're not telling ourselves a complete story, and there has to be healing. We look at, now obviously this building is not decades and decades and decades old, but if you go into the metro areas, you're going to find churches that are 150, 160 years old. Which means that as white supremacy was established as a thing in Minnesota, these churches were present. And at the very least, these churches were complicit in the building and establishing and maintaining of that white supremacy. At the very least, they were complicit, if not actively promoting that. And there has to be an account for that. When we look at, if you know some of the history of Minnesota, you know that names like Pillsbury and Crosby, Washburn, these were all names of some of the early kind of colonial land grabbers of Minnesota. I have been in churches that have stained glass windows that portray Pillsbury and Crosby and Washburn because they were members of that church. And so when we look at the story that we as people of God tell ourselves, there's a healing. It's not a complete story, and we are the lesser for it. So the healing that the church can play, number one, your engagement with Native people cannot only be missional. It can't be sending your youth group once a summer to an Indian reservation. It can't be a clothing drive. It can't be giving money to something. I mean, it can be, but it can't only be that. Your engagement with Native people needs to be more of this, okay? Because here's the thing. I am done being your mission field. I'm done. Nothing would make me happier than to never have a youth ministry go out to an Indian reservation, because it doesn't accomplish anything. I've seen it my entire life. We have, in Indian country, we have what we call missionary season. It's the summer when all of the youth groups come in to reservations, and they'll come in and they'll bring their boxes of clothes that were donated because nobody in the suburbs wants to wear them anymore. They'll bring their boxes of clothes. They drive their vans through the poorest parts of the reservation, so they're on this little poverty tour. They say, oh, this is really bad, and they'll go back to whatever church they're working with on the reservation. They'll paint the church, or they'll mend a fence. I mean, the churches on our reservations are some of the best properties around because the buildings get painted every 2 years. And then all those kids go home, and they feel bad about Indians for 2 months. And it's been that way for centuries. And nothing's changed. And so I'm done being your mission field. What I'm excited about is to be your teacher, to be your theologian, to sit down with you with our sacred scriptures and say, what if you're reading this wrong? What if we looked at it from an indigenous perspective? Now, this gets me in a lot of trouble. I have been disinvited from churches because I firmly believe that white Christians can't really know the depths of the gospel, because it's not written for you. And what do I mean by that? The whole arc of Scripture is a people living oppressed, under the thumb of an oppressor. A number of oppressors, actually. And the story of Scripture is how this unique people, as an oppressed people, navigate an oppressive system and find their own voice and find their own identity. And I'm sorry, but if you're a white American, that's not a narrative you can claim. You don't live under an oppressive system. It's very easy for you to navigate this system. And we look at the gospel, and the gospel is a story of liberation, of how oppressed people find their liberation. And so what I say is, how can you sing liberation songs if your hands have never been bound by chains? So we've been reading Scripture, and we've been reading the gospel from a perspective of power. But that's not where the gospel finds its full voice. And so the way the church has engaged oppressed communities is from a mindset of charity. And we've come in with our Bibles, and we've gone to oppressed communities, whether they're Black or Hispanic or Native. We've gone to oppressed communities with our Bibles, and we say, here, let me tell you what this says. When we as a church, we don't even know what it says. Instead, what if we came to these communities with our Bibles open, and instead of saying, let me tell you what it says, we humbly asked, will you read this story with me? And will you tell me what it says? Because it's a very different nuance when we do that. And really, how does the church heal? How does the church build? How does the church move on? So if I firmly believe that the gospel is not written for white people, that doesn't mean I'm sending you all to hell, okay? But your best hope is to sit with marginalized and oppressed communities and together discover what the gospel narrative has to say for us. So, what is the church's role? Listen, it is naive of me to say, stop making Native people your mission field. Some of these Native communities actually depend on some of the good works, but it can't only be charity. It cannot only be charity. Bring Native people in, put them behind your pulpit, put them in your classrooms. Engage in relationship. Build those relationships with indigenous nonprofits. Together discern and discover with that relationship, how do we best serve? Not in a way that heals Native people from a charitable perspective, but in a way that actually brings repair holistically to us as well.
Well, this is a really good start to that repair for at least for me, and I hope for you. I have been largely ignorant to the Native American story and really wanted to hear more. And I think this is a start. And you've been incredibly honest, which sometimes isn't fun to hear, but I think that's when I know I learn more. And I want to just check for questions.
You greeted us in your native language, and language is such an incredibly important part of any culture. What are the challenges in terms of the language, keeping the language alive within your culture?
Sure. I'm glad you asked that question. And I think this goes also to what can churches do. I believe that a church that is going to say it's committed to social justice, every church in America that makes that claim ought to give a significant portion of their budget to indigenous language and cultural reclamation programs and projects. And why do I say that? I greeted you in my indigenous language. That greeting is the sum total of my indigenous language that I know. I can't tell you what I'm going to do after I leave here in my indigenous language. And the reason why that introduction and greeting makes up the sum total of the indigenous language that I know is because for generations, the rest of the language has laid in a graveyard just outside of a Lutheran boarding school in central Wisconsin. So the damage has been severe, and the repair is going to also have to be severe. And so you know, here in the United States, there are over 537 different recognized tribes. Those 537 tribes make up, I think, last count is like 308 different languages. Some are healthier than others. The Mohican language, and you'll find that a lot of those early contact Eastern tribes that originated on the East Coast lost a lot of their language. Now there are efforts. We have, I would not say in the Mohican community that we have fluent speakers, but the language is making a comeback. And it's really interesting how the language is making a comeback. So in our possession as Mohican people, we have the second book that was ever printed in the Western Hemisphere. And it is a Bible in 2 volumes. One volume is the English, and the second volume is the Mohican language. And so 20 years ago, some PhD students in the field of linguistics out of MIT made it their doctoral project to begin a curriculum for Mohican language. And so we have some of the best linguists in the country. That project continues with others, you know, subsequent students, PhD students. So we have some of the best linguists in the country working on redeveloping the Mohican language. But it's a difficult process because it's not enough just because, you know, you have a one-to-one translation. You know, when you read it, it doesn't tell you how to pronounce these words. And so it's a process of going and following, you know, finding other languages that are still spoken that fall under a language like a mother tongue. How do they pronounce these words? And, you know, how do these syllables and, you know, how are they pronounced? And so it's really a lengthy process. But I'm very pleased to say, like, my children can go online, and there's Mohican lessons that they can follow, and that. So it's coming, but it's still, I would say, critically endangered.
Mine may not be as in-depth. I'm interested in who comes to your tours. Are there indigenous people amongst the people that come, or is it is our white nation?
Yeah, indigenous people have come on occasion. It's not out of the ordinary, but it is overwhelmingly white. It's churches a lot. It's college and university classes. Occasionally it's government and corporate stuff. So.
Anyone else? Well, thank you. We appreciate you. Thank you, Jim Bear.